trash bin was blue, the kind the city handed out to every house on the street whether you wanted it or not. And Thomas Bennett almost walked right past it the way he walked past most things now, with his eyes down and his hands in his jacket pockets and his mind somewhere in 1974. It was the color that stopped him, a flash of white against the black plastic liner, catching the porch light the way frost catches a windshield. He told himself it was nothing, a pillowcase, an old curtain. He had learned in 3 years of living alone not to trust the things his eyes decided to show him, because grief has a way of turning ordinary linen into ghosts. But he stopped anyway. He set his grocery bags down on the driveway, the milk sweating through the plastic, and he walked to the bin the way a man walks toward something he already suspects and does not want to be right about. He lifted the lid. The hinge complained, the way it always did, a small metallic groan that Eleanor used to imitate at dinner parties to make people laugh. He looked down. Lace, yellowed at the edges the way 61-year-old lace yellows. Soft and brittle at once, still holding its shape, even crumpled beneath a broken lamp and a torn cardboard box. He knew that lace. He had touched it 1,000 times over 4 decades, on anniversaries, in the cedar box at the top of the closet. On the one night a year, Eleanor took it out just to look at it. He did not need to lift it out of the bin to know what it was. He lifted it out anyway, because some part of him needed his hands to confirm what his eyes already understood. The wedding dress, Eleanor's wedding dress, balled up and stuffed into a garbage bag like a dead animal. He was still holding it, both hands cupped beneath the bodice like he was catching something falling, when the front door opened behind him and Claire stepped out onto the porch with a coffee mug in her hand, dressed for a Tuesday the way she dressed for everything, put together, composed, a woman who did not believe in looking anything but fine. "Oh," she said when she saw what he was holding. Not startled, almost bored. "I was going to explain that later." "Explain what?" Thomas said. His voice did not rise, it never did. "That I cleaned out the basement." Claire took a sip of her coffee, unhurried, the steam curling up past her face. "There was a lot of stuff down there that didn't need to keep taking up space. Old boxes. That dress. I figured it was time." Thomas looked down at the fabric in his hands, at the small tear along the waist where the seam had begun to give, at the faint brown water stain near the hem that had been there since 1974, when Eleanor's father had spilled his champagne laughing too hard at his own toast. He looked back up at Claire. "She's been dead for 3 years, Thomas," Claire said gently, the way you'd say something to a child who kept asking when a goldfish was coming back. "You need to get over it." He did not shout. He did not even feel the urge to. What he felt was something colder and stranger, something that moved through his chest like water finding a crack in a foundation. He folded the dress over his arm, the way you'd fold something that still deserved to be folded, and he looked at his daughter-in-law for a long moment. "You should be careful what you throw away," he said. Claire laughed, not cruelly, just genuinely amused. The laugh of someone who has decided an old man's grief is a kind of eccentricity to be managed rather than understood. "It's a dress, Thomas, not a time machine." She went back inside. The door clicked shut. Thomas stood on the driveway in the cooling evening with a dead woman's wedding dress draped over his arm, and no idea, not yet, how right he had been to say what he said. Because there were things sewn into that dress that even he did not know were there. To understand why the dress mattered, you would have had to know Eleanor Bennett. And there is no version of knowing her that doesn't begin with the kitchen table. It was an ordinary table. Oak, scarred along one edge where a much younger Daniel had once dragged a toy truck back and forth until the varnish wore through in a long, pale groove that Eleanor refused to sand out. "That's not damage," she used to say. "That's a diary." She said things like that. She had a way of looking at ruined things and finding the sentence that made them worth keeping. Thomas met her in 1971 at a teachers' conference in Albany that neither of them had wanted to attend. He was 23 and terrified of his first classroom. She was 22 and had already decided she would never, under any circumstances, teach math, a decision she announced to a room of strangers with the calm authority of someone reading a weather report. He fell in love with her before he knew her middle name. It took him 3 years to work up the nerve to ask, and when he finally did, on a Tuesday, in a parking lot, with no ring and no plan, she said yes before he finished the sentence. They married in the spring of 1974 in a small stone church that no longer exists, replaced now by a strip mall with a nail salon where the altar used to be. Eleanor's mother had made the dress herself, working nights for 6 weeks at a Singer machine in the back room of a house that smelled like coffee and thread. And when Eleanor put it on for the first time, she cried not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because she understood, even then, that her mother had sewn hours of her life into the seams. Every anniversary after that, without fail, Eleanor took the dress down from its box in the top of the closet and laid it across the bed and simply looked at it. Not tried it on, just looked. "Why do you do that?" Thomas asked her once, maybe their 20th anniversary, sitting on the edge of the bed watching his wife study a dress she would never wear again. "Because some things deserve to be remembered properly," Eleanor said. "Not just kept. Remembered. There's a difference, Thomas." He never forgot that sentence. He would think of it again decades later, standing in a driveway holding the same dress balled up in a trash bag, and he would understand with a kind of grief that had teeth exactly what she had meant. Their son Daniel was born in 1976. Easy labor, hard delivery, the kind of story Eleanor told at every birthday with slightly different embellishments depending on her mood. Daniel grew up in that house with the scarred kitchen table, grew up watching his father grade papers at that table every autumn, and his mother bake bread at it every winter, grew up believing, correctly, that his parents loved each other in the unglamorous, permanent way that doesn't make for good movies but makes for a good life. Daniel was gentle. That was always the word for him. Gentle to a fault, his mother used to say, half fond, half worried, because gentleness in a man could sometimes calcify into something less admirable, an allergy to conflict, an instinct to smooth things over rather than settle them. Eleanor saw that in her son early. She used to say, Daniel would rather lose a fight he should win than have the fight at all. She meant it as a warning. Nobody heeded it, including Daniel. He married Claire Lawson in 2015. Eleanor was already sick by then, though nobody used that word yet, and she stood at the wedding in a pale blue dress and smiled the whole afternoon, because that was who she was, and because she wanted, more than almost anything, to love this woman her son had chosen. She tried. God, she tried. The trouble did not announce itself. It never does. It arrived the way water arrives in a basement, quietly through a hairline crack. Long before anyone notices, the floor is wet. It started small. Claire mentioning at a Sunday dinner, maybe a year into the marriage, that the house, Thomas and Eleanor's house, had so much stuff in it. Not unkindly. Just an observation, the kind interior designers make about other people's lives. Eleanor laughed it off. That's 40 years of stuff, dear. It adds up. Then it was the closet. Claire helping Eleanor organize for a yard sale that never quite happened, opening the cedar box at the top of the closet, and lifting out the dress, turning it over in her hands. "This is beautiful," she said. And for a moment Eleanor believed she meant it, believed there was a version of this relationship where Claire could hold something that mattered to Eleanor and understand why it mattered. "You should really think about donating things like this, though. Somebody could actually wear it. Right now, it's just sitting here." "It's not sitting here to be worn," Eleanor said, taking the dress back gently. "It's sitting here to be remembered." Claire smiled the way you smile at someone whose logic you've decided not to argue with. She didn't understand. Eleanor didn't push it. That was the pattern that would define the next several years. Eleanor absorbing small disrespects, choosing peace over principle, because she loved her son and did not want to become the mother-in-law who made him choose sides. Daniel, for his part, was a master of the smallest possible intervention. When his father later would tell him quietly that Claire's comments stung, Daniel would say gently, "Dad, Claire's just trying to help. She doesn't mean anything by it." He said this so many times, over so many years, about so many things, that it stopped sounding like reassurance and started sounding like an excuse he'd rehearsed so often he no longer heard how thin it was. Thomas noticed the pattern too. He noticed it and, like his son, chose not to name it, because naming it felt like starting a war he was not sure his family could survive. That was Thomas's particular failure, if you wanted to call it that. Not cruelty, not blindness, but a devotion to peace so absolute that it sometimes let real wounds go untreated in the name of keeping everyone at the same table. Eleanor got sicker in the winter of 2021. Ovarian cancer caught late. The kind of diagnosis that rearranges a family's entire calendar around hospital appointments, and the particular exhaustion of hope that keeps deflating and reinflating on a 6-week cycle. Daniel visited when he could, which was often, but never often enough, caught as he was between his job and his wife and his father's need and his own grief, which he had not yet let himself feel because the feeling it meant admitting his mother was going to die. Claire visited less. She would say later, and this would matter, though not yet, that she didn't know how to be around illness, that hospitals made her feel like she was choking, that she loved Eleanor, in whatever way she was capable of loving someone she had never quite let herself trust. None of that was told to Thomas at the time. What he saw from where he stood was a daughter-in-law who found excuses. There was one night, that Christmas Eve, 2021, that Thomas would come to replay more than any other. He had gone downstairs for water around midnight and heard voices in the kitchen, Eleanor's low and steady, and Claire's tight and clipped, the words indistinct through the door. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He simply stood in the hallway, too tired to move and too curious not to listen. He caught only fragments. Eleanor saying something like, "I'm not trying to take anything from you." Claire saying something sharper he couldn't make out. And then, as Claire's footsteps moved toward the door and out into the cold, Eleanor's voice, very quiet, almost to herself. "One day he'll know." Thomas never asked her what she meant. He assumed at the time it was about Daniel, some small marital tension Eleanor had noticed and decided not to interfere with. He filed it away the way you file away 100 small, strange moments in a long marriage, moments that only mean something in retrospect, if they ever mean anything at all. Eleanor died in March of 2022. She went quietly in the house, in the bed she'd shared with Thomas for 41 years, with his hand in hers, and the porch light on outside the window, because she'd always hated the dark. Her last coherent words to him were not about the dress, not about Claire, not about anything Thomas would spend the next 3 years trying to piece together. She simply said, "Don't let this make you hard, Thomas. Promise me you won't let anger be the thing our son remembers about us." He promised. He had held to that promise, more or less, for 3 years. He had absorbed Claire's small cruelties with the same patient endurance Eleanor once showed. He had told himself it was what Eleanor wanted. He had believed, right up until the moment he lifted a garbage bag out of a blue plastic bin and found his wife's wedding dress balled up inside it, that patience was still the right answer. Now he wasn't sure. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the scarred one, the diary Eleanor refused to sand smooth, with the dress laid out in front of him like something he was trying to resuscitate. He smoothed the lace with his thumb. He found the tear at the waist, the place where a seam had given way under the weight of being crammed into a trash bag, and something in his chest tightened at the sight of it in a way that felt less like sentiment and more like injury, as if the tear had happened to him and not the fabric. At 10:47 p.m., his phone rang. He almost didn't answer it. He didn't recognize many numbers anymore. Most of the people who used to call him were gone or had stopped calling for reasons that had nothing to do with distance. But the screen said Patricia Lawson, and Thomas frowned, because Patricia Lawson was Claire's mother, and Patricia Lawson had never once called him directly in 10 years of overlapping holidays and shared grandchildren. He answered. "Thomas." Her voice was tight, careful, the voice of someone who had rehearsed the first sentence and had no idea what came after it. "I'm sorry to call so late." "It's all right, Patricia. Is everything okay?" A pause, long enough that he almost asked again, then, "Thomas, what did Claire do with Eleanor's dress?" He felt his whole body go still. "How do you know about that?" "Because she called me tonight, and right after it happened." Another pause, heavier this time. "Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to just answer honestly. Did you know Claire hated that dress? Not disliked it. Hated it. For years." Thomas looked down at the fabric spread across his kitchen table, at the tear along the waist, at the water stain from 1974. "No," he said slowly. "I always assumed she just thought it was clutter, something taking up space." "It wasn't about space," Patricia said. Her voice cracked slightly, an old woman's voice trying to hold together a sentence that had been forming for a long time. "Thomas, there's something you were never told about the last Christmas Eleanor was alive. I can't explain it over the phone. Can I come see you tomorrow?" He agreed before he understood why his hands were shaking. Patricia arrived the next afternoon carrying nothing but her purse and an expression Thomas had never seen on her before. Not the polished, faintly performative warmth she usually wore at family gatherings, but something rawer, something closer to fear. She sat at the kitchen table across from him, in the chair Eleanor used to sit in, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "I've known you 10 years, Patricia said finally, and I've never told you the truth about my daughter. I think it's time somebody did." Thomas said nothing. He had learned across decades of teaching teenagers that silence was often the fastest way to get someone to keep talking. "Claire told me years ago that Eleanor had humiliated her," Patricia said. "That Eleanor had said cruel things to her, implied she wasn't good enough for Daniel, told her she'd never really be family. Claire said Eleanor tried to turn Daniel against her. I believed her, Thomas. She's my daughter. Why wouldn't I believe her?" "That's not who Eleanor was," Thomas said quietly. and it was the first flash of real heat he'd shown since the driveway. "I know that now," Patricia said. "I didn't know it then. I only knew what Claire told me, and Claire told me a story where she was the victim and your wife was the villain, and I spent years being cold to Eleanor at holidays because I believed my daughter over a woman I barely knew. I'm ashamed of that, Thomas. I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest. Tell me the rest." Patricia folded her hands on the table, the way you fold your hands before confessing something. "A few weeks before Eleanor died, she called me. Not you. Me. I never told you that either." She looked up and her eyes were wet. "She asked me to do something for her. She said if she ever got too sick to explain herself, if something happened to her before she had the chance to make things right, she wanted me to find her wedding dress, not to keep it safe. She said there was something sewn into the lining. She wanted me to know it was there, in case Claire ever decided to throw away the past." Thomas felt the room tilt slightly, the particular vertigo of learning that the person you loved most in the world had been carrying something alone for years without telling you. Why would she tell you that and not me? "I think," Patricia said carefully, "because it wasn't about you, it was about Claire. And I think Eleanor was afraid that if she told you what she knew, you'd have confronted Claire, and it would have blown the family apart before Eleanor had the chance to handle it the way she wanted to handle it, gently, in her own time." "What did she know?" Patricia's hands tightened on the table. "I don't know all of it. I know it's in that letter. I know it's the reason Claire has spent years pretending to hate a dress instead of admitting what she's actually afraid of." They found the dress where Thomas had left it, spread across his bed upstairs, and together, with the careful hands of two people handling something both fragile and dangerous, they searched the lining along the waist, the same place the seam had torn in the trash bag, as if the universe had engineered its own key. Beneath the torn seam, sewn flat against the underside of the bodice, was a small manila envelope, aged and slightly yellowed, sealed with tape that had gone brittle with time. On the front, in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed 30 years of birthday cards, were the words, "For Patricia, if Claire ever decides to throw away the past." Thomas looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at the envelope like it might catch fire. "Open it," he said. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, dated 11 months before Eleanor died. "Patricia, if you're reading this, it means the thing I hoped would never happen has happened. Claire has finally acted on the anger she's been carrying for years, and it's landed somewhere it shouldn't have. I want you to know before anything else that I never blamed her for that anger. I understood it better than she thinks I did. A little over 2 years ago, I found something I was never meant to find. I won't put the details of it in writing, even now, even in a letter meant for you, because it isn't mine to tell and it never was. What I will say is this: Claire went through something as a child, something involving her own father that no child should have to carry alone. I stumbled into knowing it by accident through a conversation I overheard that I was never supposed to hear, and the moment I understood what I'd learned, I made a decision. I decided it wasn't my story to tell, not to Daniel, not to you, not even to Thomas. I think Claire has spent every day since terrified that I would use what I knew against her, that I would tell Daniel or judge her or hold it over her the way people sometimes hold pain over each other without meaning to. I never did, and I never would have. But I think the not knowing what I would do frightened her more than anything I could have actually done. It's easier to hate someone for what you're afraid they might do than to trust them not to do it. I tried, in my own clumsy way, to show her that her secret was safe with me. I was never cold to her. I never treated her differently. I think she read my kindness as strategy, as if I was being gentle with her the way you're gentle with someone you're planning to hurt later. That wasn't it, Patricia. I was gentle with her because I understood better than she knew what it costs a person to carry something like that alone, and I didn't want to be one more person who made her carry it. I'm not writing this to accuse her. I'm writing it because I am dying, and I won't be here to explain myself if things go wrong, and I don't want my silence to be mistaken after I'm gone for something it never was. If you're reading this, something has already gone wrong. I'm sorry for that. Please, whatever you do, don't let this become a weapon. Let it become an explanation instead. My hope was always that Claire would come to trust that she was safe with this family, not because the secret stayed buried, but because she had finally believed someone could know the worst thing that ever happened to her and still choose to love her anyway. I loved her, Patricia. I know she'll find that hard to believe, but I did. Eleanor Thomas read it twice. He set it down on the bed beside the dress and put his hand over his mouth, and for the first time in 3 years, in front of another person, he cried. Not loudly, not the way grief is sometimes performed in movies, just a slow, silent collapse of composure, tears running into the lines of a 68-year-old face that had spent a lifetime not letting itself fall apart in front of witnesses. Patricia reached across the bed and put her hand on his arm, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say that the letter hadn't already said better. She knew, Thomas finally whispered. All that time she knew, and she never told me, and she carried it so I wouldn't have to. She carried it so Claire wouldn't have to be exposed, Patricia corrected gently. That's not the same thing, Thomas, but it's not so different either. He picked the letter back up, read the line again. I loved her, Patricia. I know she'll find that hard to believe, but I did. And felt something inside his chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some new alloy of both, forged in the specific heat of understanding. 3 years too late. Exactly how much his wife had given to people who never knew they were receiving it. I need to talk to Claire, he said. I think, Patricia said quietly, we both do. Word had already reached Daniel by then. Not the letter, not yet, but the fact that his mother and father had spent the afternoon closeted upstairs with Claire's mother, an address Claire had thrown in the trash 2 days earlier. He arrived at his father's house that evening, straight from work, still in his tie, his face carrying the particular tightness of a man who senses a storm without yet knowing its shape. Thomas told him everything, not cruelly, not as an ambush. He sat his son down at the kitchen table, Eleanor's chair still empty between them, the way it had been empty for 3 years, and he told him about the dress, about Patricia's call, about the letter sewn into the lining, and he watched his son's face move through disbelief, then confusion, then something that looked almost like physical pain. Mom knew, Daniel said when Thomas finished. His voice was flat, stunned. Mom knew something like this happened to Claire, and she never told anyone, not even you. She was protecting her, Thomas said. The way you protect someone you love, even when they don't know you're doing it. Daniel put his face in his hands. When he looked up again, his eyes were red. Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just let me say it. Thomas waited. I've watched Claire treat you unkindly for years, Daniel said. The comments about the house, about Mom's things, about the dress. And every single time I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told you it wasn't a big deal. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but Dad, I wasn't keeping the peace. I was just choosing not to fight for you because fighting for you meant fighting with her, and I was scared of what that would do to my marriage. He shook his head slowly. I let her hurt you because it was easier than the alternative. That's not gentleness. That's cowardice. I think I've known that for a long time and just never said it out loud. Thomas reached across the table and put his hand over his son's. I forgave you for that a long time ago, he said. I understood it. I did the same thing in my own way. Your mother told me once that you'd rather lose a fight you should win than have the fight at all. She saw it in you when you were young. I think I've been quietly hoping you'd grow out of it, and I think tonight you might have. Daniel exhaled a long, shaking breath. I have to talk to Claire. We all do, Tom said. But Daniel, go in with the letter, not with anger. That's what your mother would have wanted. She said it herself. Don't let it become a weapon. The confrontation happened 2 nights later, in Daniel and Claire's living room, with Patricia present because Patricia had insisted, because, he said, she owed her daughter the truth from someone who had finally stopped believing a version of the story that had never been complete. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, arms crossed, already defensive before anyone had said a word, the particular posture of someone who has spent years anticipating an ambush and has finally decided the ambush has arrived. If this is about the dress, she said before Daniel could speak, I already apologized. I didn't realize it meant that much to you, Thomas. I'm sorry. This isn't about an apology, Thomas said quietly. This is about a letter your mother-in-law wrote before she died. Would you like to see it? He set it on the coffee table between them. Claire looked at it the way you look at something that might be venomous. She did not pick it up. Read it, Claire, Patricia said, and something in her mother's voice, some tone Claire had perhaps never heard before, stripped of the usual polite performance, made her reach for it. She read it in silence. Thomas watched her face change as she moved down the page, the defensiveness dissolving first into confusion, then into something that looked almost like fear, and finally, as she reached the last lines, into a kind of quiet devastation that made her hands begin to shake. She knew, Claire whispered. Not a question. A collapse. She's known for 2 years, Patricia said. And in 2 years, she never once used it against you. Not to your husband. Not to your mother-in-law. Not even to me, and I'm the person she wrote that letter to. She held it because she loved you, Claire, and she was terrified that if the truth came out the wrong way, it would destroy you instead of helping you. Claire's face crumpled. For the first time in the story, the polish, the composure, the careful control that had defined every interaction anyone had ever had with her, gave way entirely. I hated her, Claire said, and her voice broke on the word. I hated her because every time she looked at me, I was terrified she was going to say something. Every family dinner, every holiday, I kept waiting for her to use it, to tell Daniel, to tell everyone, to finally give me the reason I always assumed people were looking for, to decide I wasn't. She stopped, pressed her hand over her mouth. And instead, she just kept being kind to me. And I couldn't stand it. Every kind thing she did just felt like a countdown to the moment she'd stop being kind, and it never came, and I couldn't. I didn't know what to do with someone who knew the worst thing about me and just kept choosing to be gentle anyway. It felt like a trap. It felt safer to hate her than to trust that it wasn't. Patricia stepped forward and knelt in front of her daughter, taking both of Claire's hands in her own. Your father isn't the person you told me he was, she said quietly. Is he? That's what this is about. Claire nodded. unable to speak, and the story that came out over the next half hour, halting, fragmented, punctuated by long silences, was not one that needs to be told in detail here, because it belonged to Claire and not to the people around her, the same way it had belonged to her the whole time, the same way Eleanor had understood, without ever needing to be told, that some truths are not meant to be repeated, only witnessed and carried gently by the people who love you. What mattered was this. Claire had spent her entire adult life believing that if anyone truly knew what had happened to her as a child, they would see her differently, as damaged, as tainted, as somehow responsible for what had been done to her. She had built an entire personality around never being caught, never being known too deeply, never letting anyone close enough to find the things she was so certain would make them recoil. And then Eleanor Bennett had found it by accident. And instead of recoiling, she had simply kept loving her, quietly, patiently, without ever once bringing it up. And Claire had spent 2 years unable to process an act of kindness she had no framework for believing was real. "I threw away the dress," Claire said finally, her voice raw, "because I wanted to destroy the last thing that made me feel like she was still in the room, still watching me, still knowing. I told myself it was clutter. I told myself I was helping. But I think some part of me has known for 2 years that woman saw the worst thing about me and chose me anyway. And I have never in my life known what to do with being chosen like that." Thomas, who had been silent through most of this, finally spoke. His voice was not gentle in the soft, forgiving way people sometimes imagine forgiveness sounding. It was steady, clear, the voice of a man who had spent 41 years learning how his wife thought, and who understood, finally, exactly what she would want him to say. "You did not destroy her," he said. "You only showed me how much you needed her." Claire looked up at him, and something in her face broke open in a way that had nothing to do with performance, nothing to do with control. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter to me," Thomas continued. "The dress is damaged. I don't think I'll ever fully stop feeling that. But I understand now that what you did wasn't really about the dress. It was about a woman you couldn't stand being loved by, and I think somewhere underneath all of that anger, you've been grieving her longer than any of us realized." Nothing was resolved that night, not entirely, not in the way endings sometimes pretend things resolve. Claire did not become a different person in an evening. Thomas did not forget, in a single conversation, the sight of his wife's dress balled up in a trash bag. Some wounds heal slowly, in the ordinary, unglamorous way that most real healing happens through months rather than moments. But something shifted. Daniel, for the first time in his marriage, told his wife plainly that he loved her and would not protect lies anymore, not about Eleanor, not about anything. And Claire, instead of retreating into her old defensiveness, agreed with him, because she was tired, she said. Tired in a way she hadn't let herself admit in years. Tired of building an entire self around not being known. She began seeing a therapist that spring. Nobody in the family treated this as a magic fix, and nobody expected it to be one. Thomas established, calmly and without cruelty, a boundary that had never existed before. Eleanor's belongings were his to keep or give away, and no one else's decision to make. Claire accepted this without argument, which was itself a kind of quiet transformation nobody commented on directly, because commenting on it would have made it feel like a performance rather than a change. The dress itself was restored as much as it could be restored. A seamstress in town, an old student of Thomas's, as it happened, a woman named Rosa, who had sat in the back row of his 10th grade history class 30 years earlier and still called him Mr. Bennett, cleaned it carefully and reinforced the torn seam at the waist. She offered to hide the tear entirely, to make it invisible the way a good restoration usually tries to make damage invisible. Thomas told her not to. "Leave it," he said. "Just make sure it doesn't tear further, but leave the mark where it is." He had it framed instead of boxed, mounted in a shadow case with UV-safe glass, and hung in the hallway of his house where anyone walking from the kitchen to the living room would pass beneath it. Beneath the frame, he had a small brass plaque engraved with a single line, one he had turned over in his mind for weeks before settling on it, one that felt, to him, like the truest thing he could say about the last 3 years of his life. Some things survive because someone chooses to remember. Months passed. The seasons did what seasons do. Thomas kept teaching, informally now, in the sense that retired teachers never really stop teaching. He tutored a neighbor's grandson in American history on Thursday afternoons, and he found to his mild surprise that he still loved the work as much as he ever had. Claire's visits became less rare. They were careful visits at first, cautious on both sides, the kind of interactions that carry the specific fragility of two people who have hurt each other and are trying, without a map, to find their way back to something workable. But they were real visits, not performances. And slowly, the way frost thaws, not all at once, but in patches, something like warmth began returning to the space between Thomas and his daughter-in-law. In November, almost exactly a year after the night the dress went into the trash, Claire arrived at Thomas's house on a Sunday afternoon carrying a small wooden box he didn't recognize. She stood on the porch for a moment before knocking, the way people sometimes stand at the edge of something before stepping into it. And when Thomas opened the door, she held the box out to him without much preamble. "I need to give you this," she said. "I've had it for years, and I should have given it to you a long time ago." Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, gone soft with age, was a photograph Thomas hadn't seen in over a decade. Eleanor on her wedding day, standing in front of the little stone church that no longer existed, laughing at something just outside the frame, her veil caught mid-motion in a breeze that had stopped existing the moment the shutter closed. It was the photograph that used to sit on Eleanor's nightstand, the one Thomas had assumed was simply lost, sometime during the chaos of her final illness, packed away in some box that never resurfaced. "I found it years ago," Claire admitted, not meeting his eyes. "During the visit where I first saw the dress, I don't fully know why I took it. I think some part of me wanted something of hers that felt like proof that she was real, that the kindness was real, so I could look at it later and try to understand why it scared me so much. I kept telling myself I'd give it back. I never found the right moment. I'm sorry it took me this long." Thomas took the photograph carefully, the way you take something you thought you'd lost forever, and he looked at his wife's laughing face for a long moment before looking back up at Claire. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Not a hug. Not yet. Some bridges take longer to rebuild than others, and Thomas had learned across a long life not to rush the ones that mattered, but it was enough. It was, in its own quiet way, exactly enough. He had the photograph framed too and hung it beside the dress in the hallway, so that anyone walking through his house now passed beneath both of them. The woman who had chosen kindness even when it cost her, and the proof that her kindness had eventually, in its own slow and complicated way, found its way home. A year after that, on a bright, cold Saturday in late autumn, Thomas's 7-year-old granddaughter, Daniel and Claire's daughter, Emily, who had been 3 years old when her grandmother died, and remembered her now only as a warmth in an old photographs, stood in the hallway with her small hand pressed against the glass of the display case, looking up at the dress hanging inside it. "Grandpa," she said, "whose dress is that?" "That was your grandmother's," Thomas said, kneeling down beside her so that they were the same height, the way he always did when he wanted a child to understand he was really listening and really answering. "She wore that dress the day she married me." Emily studied the fabric for a long moment, the way children study things with the seriousness adults sometimes forget how to access. "Why is there a tear?" she asked, pointing to the small, reinforced seam at the waist, still visible beneath the glass, still deliberately unhidden. Thomas smiled, a real smile, the kind that had become easier over the past 2 years, the kind that no longer felt like a betrayal of his grief, but like an honoring of it. "Because people aren't perfect," he said. "Sometimes the people we love hurt each other, even without meaning to. Sometimes they hurt each other on purpose, and it takes a long time to understand why." "Then why did you keep it? Wouldn't it have been easier to just get rid of it and pretend it never happened?" "It might have been easier," Thomas admitted. "But your grandmother used to say that some things don't deserve to just be kept. They deserve to be remembered, properly, even the parts that are torn." He touched the glass gently over the seam, especially the parts that are torn, maybe. Because love isn't about pretending nothing ever went wrong. It's about choosing to stay and to understand and to forgive, even after something breaks. "The dress survived, Emily. Our family survived. And I think in the end that's a better story than one where nothing bad ever happened at all." Emily considered this with the particular gravity of a 7-year-old encountering an idea slightly too big for her. And then, satisfied in the way children are satisfied when an answer feels true, even before they fully understand it, she nodded and ran off toward the kitchen, where her father was making Sunday pancakes and her mother, Claire, stood at the counter, humming quietly to herself, entirely at ease in a house that had once held nothing but distance for her. Thomas stood alone in the hallway a moment longer, looking up at the dress and the photograph hanging side by side, at the torn seam that had been deliberately left visible, at the woman laughing in a moment 60 years gone that had somehow, through all of it, found its way to being seen and understood and loved by the very people who once could not bear to look at it directly. He thought about the promise he'd made Eleanor at the end. "Don't let this make you hard. Don't let anger be the thing our son remembers about us." And he understood now in a way he hadn't understood in the driveway 2 years earlier, that keeping that promise had never meant staying silent. It had meant choosing, again and again, patience over rage, understanding over punishment, truth over comfort. It had meant trusting that the people he loved were capable of becoming better than their worst moments, the same way Eleanor had trusted it about Claire long before anyone else had reason to. The dress had survived. The marriage, the son's marriage, the whole fragile architecture of the family had survived. And the truth, buried for 2 years in a seam of lace and finally torn open by the very act meant to destroy it, had survived too. And in surviving, had done something none of them could have predicted. It had taught an entire family how to finally, imperfectly, patiently learn to survive itself. If you were Thomas, sitting in that driveway with your wife's wedding dress balled up in your hands, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven Claire once you understood the truth behind her anger? Or would throwing away Eleanor's dress have been the one line she could never uncross for you? There's no single right answer to that question, and maybe that's the point. Some betrayals come from cruelty. Some come from wounds so old and so hidden that even the person carrying them doesn't fully understand what they're protecting. If stories like this one, about family, about dignity, about the slow and difficult work of forgiveness, mean something to you, stay close. There's another story waiting, and somewhere in it, there's probably a piece of your own life looking back at you.